The first rogue died before his boots hit the moss. Malakor didn't offer him the dignity of a growl or a warning. He simply dropped from the canopy like a guillotine blade, his hand clamping over the intruder's mouth to stifle the scream, his other hand snapping the cervical spine with a wet, sickening crack that was swallowed instantly by the hum of the forbidden forest. The body went limp in his arms, heavy and reeking of fear, but Malakor didn't let it fall. He lowered the corpse silently to the earth, his golden eyes already locking onto the second shadow creeping through the ferns. Zephyra slept 20 feet away, curled in the dirt like a discarded thing, completely unaware that death was walking toward her. She didn't know she was being hunted. She didn't know that the silver petal flowers blooming around her head were a hunter's trap, exhaling a neurotoxin sweet enough to keep her under while they dragged her away. And she certainly didn't know that the Alpha King, the monster mothers used to frighten their pups into obedience, was currently tearing a man's throat out with his bare teeth just to ensure she saw the sunrise. Malakor moved with a violence that terrified even his own wolf. He intercepted the second rogue in a blur of motion, driving a knee into the man's solar plexus so hard it shattered the ribcage. The rogue's eyes bulged, capillaries bursting, but before he could gasp, Malakor ended him. A quick, brutal twist. Silence returned to the clearing, heavy and metallic with the scent of fresh blood. He stood over the bodies, his chest heaving, his hands painted crimson. The beast inside him clawed at his ribs, roaring demanding he wake the girl and claim her right here on the blood-soaked earth. 19 nights. He had been guarding her for 19 nights. 19 nights of watching Zephyra Thorn drag her bedroll into the toxic glow of the forest because she felt safer among poisonous mushrooms than she did in her own home. Malakor looked at her sleeping form, his heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against his sternum. She looked so small, so devastatingly breakable. Her red hair was a fire spilled across the dark moss, and her face, even in sleep, held a tightness, a sorrow that made him want to burn the entire world down just to make her smile. He wiped his bloody hands on his leather trousers, scrubbing at the red stains until the skin was raw. He couldn't touch her like this. He was a creature of death, a king who ruled through fear and execution. She was the only pure thing left in a world that was rotting from the inside out. The mate bond pulled at him, a physical hook in his gut. It wasn't just attraction, it was gravity. It was the terrifying realization that if she died, he would simply cease to exist. But he stayed in the shadows. He didn't step into the light. He didn't wake her up and tell her, "I am yours." Because she wouldn't believe him. He knew what they called her. The broken one. The empty wolf. He knew she had spent 4 years apologizing for her existence, convinced she was a biological failure because her wolf hadn't surfaced. If he revealed himself now, if the Alpha King dropped to his knees in the dirt and offered her a crown, she wouldn't see it as love. She would see it as another expectation she couldn't meet. Another powerful male demanding something she didn't have. "I will not be your burden," he whispered, the words tasting like ash and iron. "I will be your shadow." A shift in the wind brought the scent of the silver petals to his nose, cloying, sickly sweet. Panic flared in his chest, colder than the violence. The neurotoxin. It was too close to her face. Malakor moved. The transition from executioner to guardian was instant. He crossed the clearing, stepping over the corpses of the men who had come to sell her blood, and knelt beside her. He held his breath, terrified that the scent of death on his skin would wake her. Slowly, agonizingly, he slid his arms beneath her sleeping form. She was lighter than air. As he lifted her, she sighed, a soft, broken sound that tore through his defenses. She turned instinctively toward his heat, her face pressing against the rough leather of his tunic, right over his racing heart. The contact nearly broke him. A shockwave of golden fire slammed through his veins, the mate bond singing a high, desperate note. "Mine. Mine," his wolf howled, begging to lick the tears dried on her cheeks, to wrap around her and never let go. Malakor squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached, fighting the urge to bury his face in her neck and inhale her scent of rain and sorrow. He carried her 20 yards upwind, away from the trap, moving her as if she were made of spun glass. He set her down beneath the protective arch of a willow tree, arranging her limbs with a tenderness that felt foreign to his warrior's hands. She shivered. The night air was biting. Without a second thought, Malakor unclasped his heavy, fur-lined cloak. It was a king's mantle, worth more than the village she lived in, soaked in his scent of pine, storm, and power. He draped it over her, tucking the edges around her shoulders to seal in the warmth, effectively wrapping her in his claim without her ever knowing. He lingered for one dangerous second, his hand hovering inches from her cheek. He wanted to touch her so badly his fingers trembled. "Sleep, Zephyra," he breathed into the silence. "They won't touch you. Not while I breathe." He forced himself to stand, to back away, to leave her safe and warm while he returned to the cold. He climbed back into the tree line, a sentinel in the dark, watching over the girl who thought she was unlovable, unaware that the most powerful monster in the kingdom was currently deciding which stars to pull down from the sky just to light her way home. Zephyra woke to the song of a mourning dove and the crushing weight of survival. The first thing she registered was the absence of the cold. She had fallen asleep shivering in the dirt, her body curled tight against the damp roots, but now she was enveloped in a warmth so profound it felt like a fever dream. She sat up slowly, the movement heavy and disoriented, and a massive fold of dark fabric slid from her shoulders to pool in her lap. It was a cloak. Not the rough-spun wool of the village weavers, but a heavy, masterfully crafted mantle lined with fur as soft as a cloud and black as midnight. She ran her fingers over the leather exterior, feeling the scars of use, the quality of the stitching. It was a king's garment, or at least a warlord's. She brought the fabric to her face, inhaling deeply before she could stop herself. It didn't smell like the damp earth or the rotting leaves of the forbidden forest. It smelled of pine, ozone, and something wild, like the air right before a lightning strike. It smelled of a violence she should have feared, yet her pulse didn't race with terror. It raced with something else. She scrambled to her feet, the cloak clutching at her ankles. She scanned the clearing, her heart hammering against her ribs. The landscape was wrong. She remembered curling up near the patch of white flowers. She vividly recalled their sickle-sweet scent lulling her down. But now she was 20 yards away, beneath the protective arch of a willow. The flowers were gone, or rather, she was gone from them. Someone had moved her. "Hello," her voice cracked, brittle and unused. The forest swallowed the sound. "Before we continue, where in the world are you listening from? I see comments from everywhere and it makes my day." Alright, back to the story. Things are about to get intense. If you're already hooked by Zephyra's story, please hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want more emotional werewolf romances like this. There were no tracks. No broken branches. Just the lingering, heavy silence of a predator that had decided not to eat. Zephyra clutched the cloak tighter around herself, a phantom warmth ghosting over her skin where hands must have held her. The realization made her knees weak. Someone had been here. Someone strong enough to lift her without waking her, and gentle enough to leave her covered against the chill. She shouldn't keep it. It was dangerous to possess something so valuable, something that clearly belonged to a powerful male. But she couldn't bring herself to leave it in the dirt. With shaking hands, she folded the heavy garment and draped it over her arm, a secret weight to carry back to the life she hated. The walk back to the pack lands took an hour, and every step was a reminder of what she wasn't. Most wolves felt the forest as an extension of themselves. They felt the prey in the brush, the wind in their fur. Zephyra felt only the dull, grinding ache of a body at war with itself. It was a physical sickness, this emptiness. It started in the marrow of her shin bones, a phantom itch of fur that refused to breach the skin, a burning pressure in her jaw where fangs should have descended years ago. It was like being buried alive in a coffin the exact shape of her human form. She could feel the wolf scratching at the lid, desperate and suffocating, but the lock simply would not turn. By the time the familiar slate-gray roofs of her village came into view, the ache had settled into a throbbing migraine behind her eyes. She paused at the tree line, hiding the cloak deep inside her satchel, burying it beneath her spare tunic. She smoothed her hair, wiped the dirt from her cheeks, and stepped out of the sanctuary of the trees and into the judgment of the open air. They were waiting for her.
Of course they were.
Her father stood on the front porch, his arms crossed over his chest, his face carved from granite. Her mother sat on the porch swing, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers, her eyes red-rimmed and frantic. And standing between them, radiant in the morning sun, was Irina. Irina, who had shifted effortlessly at 16. Irina, whose coat was a flawless honeygold. Irina, who looked at Zephyra not with disgust, but with a pity that burned worse than acid. Zephyra, her father said. The name wasn't a greeting, it was an indictment. I'm sorry, Zephyra whispered, stepping onto the gravel path. I needed air. You disappeared, her mother shrilled, standing up so quickly the swing banged against the wall. Do you have any idea what time it is?
The council begins in 6 hours.
We thought you had run away. I didn't run, Zephyra lied, though the note she had burned in the forest fire pit said otherwise. I just fell asleep. In the forbidden forest. Irina descended the steps, her movements graceful and fluid. She reached out, tucking a stray lock of red hair behind Zephyra's ear. Oh, Zeph.
You smell like rot and damp.
You can't go to the ball smelling like a grave. I'm not going, Zephyra said, her voice trembling but firm.
She looked past her sister to her father. Please, Dad. Don't make me do this. You know what happens.
They look at me, they smell that I'm empty, and they laugh. Or worse, they just look through me. Her father descended the stairs slowly, the wood groaning under his weight. He stopped inches from her, blocking out the sun.
He was a good man once, Zephyra remembered. Before the shame of having a broken daughter had hollowed him out.
You are going, he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. We have not spent the last 4 years bleeding this family dry for you to quit now.
Dad.
Do you know why we didn't repair the roof this winter? He cut her off. Do you know why I turned down the position in the Western Pack?
Because we needed the specialists.
We needed the healers, the shamans, the herbalists. We have poured everything, our savings, our reputation, our future, into fixing you.
The words struck her like physical blows.
She took a step back, her breath hitching.
I didn't ask you to do that.
We did it because you are our daughter, her mother sobbed, sinking back onto the swing. We just want you to be normal, Zephyra.
Is that so wrong? To want you to have a life.
I have a life, Zephyra argued, though it felt like a lie even to her own ears. You have an existence, her father corrected brutally.
You are 19 years old.
If you do not find a mate at this council, if you do not secure a connection that offers you protection, you will be nothing.
A rogue without a pack.
A wolf without a skin. He reached out, gripping her shoulders. His fingers dug into her flesh, desperate and angry. We are out of money, Zephyra. We out of favors. This council is the end of the line. You will go, you will wear the dress your sister bought you, and you will smile. You will find someone, anyone, who will overlook your defect. Zephyra looked at Irina. Her perfect sister looked away, unable to hold her gaze. She looked at her mother, who was weeping into her hands.
She was a sinking ship, and she was dragging them all down with her.
I can't shift, Zephyra whispered, the confession tearing out of her throat.
No dress will change that. No smile will hide it.
Why can't you just accept that this is who I am? Because, her father said, releasing her with a shove that sent her stumbling back, what you are is not enough. He turned his back on her, walking into the house.
Now.
You leave in 2 hours. Zephyra stood alone on the gravel path, the morning sun feeling cold against her skin. Inside her satchel, the heavy black cloak pressed against her hip, a silent, confusing weight.
Pine and something wild. For a fleeting second, she wished she had stayed in the forest. She wished the owner of that cloak had woken her up. Even a monster would have been kinder than this.
She swallowed the bile rising in her throat, clutched the strap of her bag, and followed her family inside to put on her costume. The dress was a beautiful, shimmering cage. Zephyra stood before the cracked vanity mirror in her bedroom, her breath hitching as she smoothed the pale blue silk down her hips. It was a masterpiece of tailoring, purchased with money her family didn't have, designed to cling to curves she usually hid beneath shapeless wool. The color was meant to highlight the fire of her hair and the green of her eyes, to make her look like a prize worthy of a high-ranking alpha. But to Zephyra, it looked like a lie. The silk felt cold against her skin, slippery and suffocating, like being wrapped in a frozen river. In the glass, a stranger stared back. A girl painted in desperation, wrapped in expensive fabric to distract from the hollowness inside. "It fits perfectly," Irina said softly from the doorway, her own golden dress shimmering like sunlight. She sounded hopeful, but her scent, honey and fresh rain, was spiked with anxiety. "It fits a copse," Zephyra murmured, turning away from her reflection. She walked over to her bed, where the heavy, fur-lined black cloak lay hidden beneath her pillow. She hadn't told anyone about it. It was her secret, a tactile memory of the forest that felt more real than the masquerade she was about to perform. She pressed her hand against the pillow, imagining she could feel the phantom heat of the man, the monster, who had covered her. Whoever he was, he had seen her sleep in the dirt and offered warmth. Her family saw her awake and offered a costume. "We have to go," her father's voice boomed from the hallway, stripped of patience. Zephyra withdrew her hand, squared her shoulders, and walked out to meet her execution. The journey to the Lunar Council Hall was a blur of nausea and silence. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt, the sensory assault began. The council hall was a fortress of black stone built into the side of the mountain, illuminated by thousands of torches that filled the air with the smell of burning pitch. But the smoke couldn't mask the other scents. It hit Zephyra the moment she stepped onto the cobblestones, the cloying, suffocating stench of desperation. Hundreds of wolves had gathered. The air was thick with pheromones, the aggressive, musk-heavy spice of posturing alphas, and the overly sweet, floral perfumes used by unmated females to mask their fear. It was a meat market in the most literal sense. "Chin up," her mother hissed, pinching Zephyra's elbow. "Smile. Don't let them see you shaking." They entered the great hall, a cavernous space where the ceiling was lost in shadow and the walls were lined with the banners of the 6 territories. The noise was deafening, a roar of laughter, growls, and the clinking of goblets. But as the unmated females began to line up along the northern wall, a hush of anticipation fell over the crowd. This was the ritual. The inspection. Zephyra took her place between a girl from the river pack who smelled of lavender and terror, and a tall, confident woman from the mountains who radiated heat. Zephyra felt like a ghost sandwiched between the living. She clasped her hands in front of her, the blue silk digging into her waist, and fixed her gaze on a torch bracket on the opposite wall, trying to dissociate. "I am not here. I am in the forest. I am asleep under the willow." But she couldn't block out the alphas. They moved down the line like buyers at an auction, holding wine goblets, their eyes critical and hungry. Some stopped to chat, murmuring compliments that sounded like appraisals. Others sniffed the air, their upper lips curling as they scented the lineages, the fertility, the power. When they passed Zephyra, the reaction was always the same. They would pause, drawn by the red hair and the dress, and lean in. Then, they would freeze. The interest in their eyes would curdle into confusion, then disgust. They couldn't smell a wolf. They smelled only human skin and soap. To them, she was a void, a genetic dead end wrapped in silk. "Empty," one alpha muttered to his companion, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Waste of fabric." Zephyra's cheeks burned, but she didn't flinch. She was used to being invisible. It was being seen and rejected that flayed the skin from her bones. She prayed for it to be over. She prayed for the floor to open up. Then, the air shifted. The alpha moving down the line wasn't like the others. He didn't strut, he prowled. He was a massive wall of muscle scarred by violence, his face a map of old wars. A jagged line of white puckered skin ran from his temple, bisecting his left eyebrow and slicing down to his jaw, pulling his lip into a permanent, cruel snare. Alpha Vex.
the scourge of the southern borders. The girl beside Zephyra trembled so hard her bracelets jingled. Vex ignored her. He ignored the mountain wolf. He stopped directly in front of Zephyra, blocking out the torchlight. His scent was overwhelming, rotting leaves, copper blood, and something oily, like stagnation. It made Zephyra's skin crawl, her non-existent wolf bristling in the dark corners of her mind. Vex didn't look at her dress. He didn't look at her chest or her hips. He looked into her eyes, his good eye, a pale, milky blue, narrowing with surgical precision. He leaned in, inhaling deeply. But unlike the others, he didn't recoil. He paused, tasting the air, his head tilting to the side like a dog hearing a high-pitched whistle. Empty. Vex rasped, the words sounding like metal grinding on stone. Zephyra held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Yes, Alpha. Vex smiled, and it was a terrifying thing. It didn't reach his eyes. No, he whispered, low enough that only she could hear. Not empty. Hidden. A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty hall shot down Zephyra's spine. He wasn't looking at a broken girl. He was looking at a locked chest, and he was wondering if he had the key. You smell like old magic, girl, Vex murmured, stepping closer until she could feel the heat of his body, suffocating and dangerous. You smell like a secret someone is trying very hard to keep. He reached out, a scarred finger tracing the line of her jaw, hovering just above the skin. Zephyra wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But she was frozen, pinned by the intelligence in his gaze. He suspected. He didn't know what she was, not yet, but he knew the lie of the blue dress was just that, a lie. I will be watching you, Zephyra Thorn, Vex promised, pulling back with a slow, calculating smirk. The empty ones are usually the most boring. But you make my scars itch. He moved on, leaving Zephyra trembling in the wake of his oily scent, the silk dress suddenly feeling less like a costume and more like a target painted on her back. The relief of Alpha Vex walking away was short-lived. He had barely disappeared into the throng of drinking wolves when the atmosphere in the great hall shifted again, this time violently. It didn't start with a sound. It started with the silence. It began at the massive iron doors at the southern end of the hall and rolled forward like a shockwave, extinguishing conversations, freezing laughter in throats, and turning the raucous meat market into a tomb. The air pressure in the room dropped, heavy and static-charged, making ears pop and hair stand on end. Even the torches seemed to dim, their flames shrinking as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room to feed a larger fire. Zephyra pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her heart stuttering. Beside her, the girl from the river pack stopped trembling and went completely still, her eyes wide with a primal, instinctual terror. He's here, someone whispered, the words trembling in the sudden quiet. The heavy doors groaned open, not pushed by guards, but seemingly yielding to a force of nature. And then, Malakor walked in. He was a myth made flesh, a nightmare wrapped in black leather and shadows. Zephyra had heard the stories, everyone had. They said the Alpha King hadn't attended a lunar council in a decade because he found the display of desperate mating rituals beneath him. They said he ruled his territory with a cruelty that kept the borders bleeding. They said he had no heart, only a stone where the wolf should be. Looking at him now, Zephyra believed every word. He was taller than the other alphas, broader in the shoulders, moving with a lethal grace that made the other men in the room look like clumsy pups. He wore no ceremonial silks, no jewels to display his wealth. He wore simple, functional combat leathers that absorbed the light, stained with the dark, matte patches of old blood that he hadn't bothered to clean. He didn't look like a suitor. He looked like an executioner who had kicked down the door of a party. The crowd parted for him instantly, a sea of terrified wolves scrambling to get out of his path. Malakor didn't acknowledge them. His face was a mask of bored, dangerous indifference, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his dark hair falling over eyes that burned with a terrifying, golden intelligence. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. The sheer weight of his presence was suffocating. He radiated power, not the flashy, insecure aggression of Vex, but something ancient. Absolute. It was the power of a mountain that could crush you without ever moving.
Zephyra wanted to look away, to hide behind the girl next to her, to sink into the stone wall and disappear.
But she couldn't.
She was paralyzed, pinned by the gravity of him. Malakor began to scan the line of unmated females.
He didn't look at them with lust or assessment.
He looked at them the way a wolf looks at trees, obstacles to be ignored. His gaze swept over the silk dresses, the desperate smiles, the trembling hands, dismissing them one by one.
Until he reached the end of the line. Until he reached her.
When his golden eyes locked onto hers, the world didn't just stop, it shattered.
It wasn't a spark. It wasn't the flutter of butterflies poets wrote about. It was a collision.
A physical impact that slammed into Zephyra's chest with the force of a battering ram, knocking the breath from her lungs.
Primal resonance.
The sound of it roared in her ears, a deafening, high-pitched frequency that drowned out the room, the fear, the shame. Heat, molten and blinding, erupted in the center of her chest and flooded her veins, burning away the cold of the blue silk dress in a heartbeat. And then, the impossible happened. Deep inside the hollow cage of her soul, in the dark place where she had buried her hope 4 years ago, something moved.
It wasn't the phantom itch of fur she was used to. It was a surge.
A violent, desperate thrashing against her ribs. Her wolf, the creature she had been told was dead, the beast the healers said didn't exist, woke up screaming. It clawed at the back of her throat, slamming against the barriers of her mind, roaring a single, deafening command that shook Zephyra to her core.
Him.
Zephyra gasped, her hands flying to her chest, clutching the silk as if to keep her heart from ripping through the fabric. She stared at Malakor, wide-eyed and reeling, unable to comprehend what was happening. Malakor hadn't moved. He stood across the hall, statue still, his golden gaze devouring her. For a fleeting second, the mask of the ruthless king slipped. Zephyra saw something roar in his eyes, a flash of desperate relief, a hunger so profound it terrified her, and beneath it all, a recognition that stripped her bare.
He saw her.
He didn't see the broken girl, or the empty vessel, or the failed project.
He saw her.
The bond pulled taut between them, a vibrating wire of energy that demanded she run to him, that she fall to her knees, that she let him tear the world apart to get to her. She took a staggering step forward, her body moving without her permission, drawn to his gravity. Mate, her awakened wolf howled, battering against the seal.
Mate. 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 But the movement broke the spell.
Malakor blinked, and the mask slammed back into place. His gaze flicked to the side, noticing the way the other alphas were watching him, watching her.
He saw Vex narrowing his eyes in the corner.
He saw her father staring with gaping, greedy shock.
He saw the danger circling her like sharks smelling blood in the water.
If he claimed her now, with the bond so fresh and her power so unstable, they would tear her apart to get to him. Malakor's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering in his cheek. The golden fire in his eyes went cold, shutting like a steel door.
He turned his back on her. The severance was brutal.
It felt like he had reached into her chest and ripped the heat out with his bare hands. The connection snapped, leaving Zephyra reeling, the cold rushing back in to fill the void with agonizing speed.
He walked away.
He turned to a server, taking a goblet of wine, and began speaking to a high-ranking alpha from the west, completely ignoring the girl in the blue dress who was currently suffocating on the other side of the room. Zephyra stood frozen, her hand still clutching her chest. The surge of her wolf died down, retreating back into the darkness, leaving only a hollow ache that was worse than the emptiness had ever been.
He had felt it. She knew he had. She had seen the recognition in his eyes.
And then, he had looked away. The interpretation settled over her like a shroud, heavy and familiar.
Rejection. Of course. Why had she thought it would be different? He was the Alpha King.
He needed a queen, a warrior, a wolf of immense power.
And what was she? A defect in a pretty dress.
A genetic mistake that couldn't even shift. He had looked at her, seen the broken thing she was, and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Stupid, she whispered, the word trembling on her lips. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and humiliating. Stupid, stupid girl. She shrank back against the wall, wishing the stone would swallow her whole, while across the room, the King of Shadows gripped his wine goblet so hard the metal warped beneath his fingers, fighting the urge to turn around and burn the entire hall to the ground for the crime of making her cry. Zephyra was busy trying to disappear into the stonework, counting the seconds until she could flee, when the world exploded. It wasn't the polite, murmured disruption of a late arrival. It was a detonation. The heavy oak side doors, reinforced with iron bands, didn't just open. They splintered inward, showering the nearest tables with jagged shards of wood and twisted metal.
The music died instantly.
The scent of wine and perfume was annihilated by a new, acrid stench, unwashed bodies, wet dog, and the copper tang of bloodlust.
Rogues.
A pack of them poured into the hall like a mudslide, their movements twitchy and uncoordinated, their eyes rolling with a chemically induced madness. They weren't here for the food, and they weren't here for the territory. They were hunting. "Where is she?" the lead rogue screamed, his voice a gargled, wet sound, as if his throat had been crushed and poorly healed. He scrambled onto a banquet table, kicking over a tureen of soup. "Where is the Dreamweaver?"
"We smell the magic. Give us the Dreamweaver."
The word rippled through the room, causing confusion rather than recognition. Dreamweaver. Most, it was a nursery rhyme, a fairy tale about witches who could walk in sleep. But to Zephyra, the word struck like a physical blow. The secret Vex had hinted at, the old magic he had smelled. Was this it? Chaos erupted. The alphas in the room, initially stunned, roared into action. Tables were overturned as defensive barriers. Women screamed and scrambled toward the back exits. The air filled with the sickening sounds of bones cracking and fabric tearing as dozens of wolves shifted mid-stride, fur bursting through silk and velvet. Zephyra couldn't move. It was the nightmare she had lived with for 4 years, the paralysis. While everyone else's instincts screamed *shift and fight*, her body just screamed *. She was a statue in a blue silk dress, standing alone against the wall, a beacon of stillness in a sea of violent motion. There! A rogue with mangy, patchwork fur spotted her. He was huge, his human form distorted by a partial shift, claws elongated and dripping with saliva.
He pointed a crooked finger at her.
"The empty one. She smells like the void."
He lunged.
Zephyra saw him coming in slow motion. She saw the yellow of his teeth, the madness in his dilated pupils. She saw the trajectory of his leap, calculated to tear her throat out before she could even scream. She tried to raise her hands, a futile, human gesture of defense, and closed her eyes, waiting for the bite.
It never came.
There was a sound like a thunderclap, a displacement of air so violent it knocked the wind out of her. "Touch her," a voice growled, low and vibrating with a tectonic rage, "and I will scatter your pack across 6 territories."
Zephyra snapped her eyes open. Malakor stood between her and the rogue. He had crossed 30 feet of crowded hall in a heartbeat, moving faster than the eye could track. He hadn't shifted yet. He had caught the rogue, a creature weighing easily 200 pounds, by the throat with one hand. Malakor held him suspended in the air, his arm steady as a steel beam, his golden eyes burning with a cold, absolute fury. The rogue choked, clawing uselessly at Malakor's leather gauntlet. "You interrupted my evening," Malakor stated, his voice devoid of emotion but terrifyingly loud in the sudden hush. With a sickening crunch, he squeezed. The rogue went limp, dropping to the floor like a sack of wet grain. The remaining 5 rogues froze, their eyes locking onto the dark figure standing over their fallen leader. They growled, crouching low, preparing to rush him all at once. Malakor didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his fists. He simply let go of the leash. The transformation was seamless. There was no bone-breaking agony, no awkward transition. One moment, a man in black leather stood before Zephyra. The next, a shadow erupted from his skin. A massive wolf, midnight black and standing nearly as tall as a horse at the shoulder, materialized in the space where the king had been. His eyes were burning pools of liquid gold. His teeth were white daggers. When the rogues attacked, it wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Malakor moved with surgical precision. He didn't waste energy on roaring or posturing. He was a blur of darkness and violence. He sidestepped a lunging attacker, his jaws snapping shut on the rogue's spine with a decisive *crack star. In the same motion, his massive paw swiped outward, claws extending like scythes, nearly decapitating a second attacker. Zephyra pressed herself flat against the wall,
her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the King of Shadows dismantled the threat. It was brutal, efficient, and terrifyingly beautiful. He was a creature of pure death, yet every movement was calculated to keep the violence from her.
He was a living shield.
Within 10 seconds, it was over.
6 rogues lay broken on the stone floor.
The rest of the hall was silent, the other alphas standing back, giving the massive black wolf a wide berth. Malakor stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving slightly. He turned his massive head, his golden eyes locking onto Zephyra once more. There was blood on his muzzle, not his own. For a moment, the beast stared at her, and she felt that pull again, that primal resonance tugging at her soul, demanding she reach out, touch his fur, soothe the savage thing he had become.
Slowly, the darkness receded.
The fur retracted, the bones realigned, and Malakor stood before her in human form again.
He didn't look at the bodies.
He looked only at her, his gaze scanning her face, her neck, checking for injuries she didn't have.
"Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough.
"No," Zephyra whispered, her voice trembling. Thank you." He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to explain why he had turned away earlier, or perhaps to tell her to leave. But the moment was shattered by a slow, sarcastic clapping.
"Bravo," a voice drawled. "Truly,
a magnificent display, Your Majesty."
The crowd parted.
Alpha Vex stepped forward, stepping over the body of a dead rogue with casual disregard. He held a glass of wine in one hand, completely unbothered by the violence. Malakor stiffened, turning slowly to face the scarred Alpha.
"Vex,
you have something to say."
"I do,"
Vex smiled, his good eye gleaming with malicious triumph. He walked until he was standing just outside of Malakor's reach, but his attention was fixed entirely on Zephyra. "We were all wondering," Vex announced, raising his voice so it carried to the rafters. "Why would a pack of chemically altered rogues commit suicide by attacking the High Council? What prize could possibly be worth such a foolish death?"
He pointed at the dead leader. "He told us, didn't he?
They were hunting at Dreamweaver Star." Vex turned his gaze to Zephyra, his smile widening into a sneer. And lo and behold, they went straight for the girl who cannot shift. The girl who smells of old magic. "She is a defect," Zephyra's father spoke up from the crowd, his voice wavering between fear and defense. She is a danger." Vex roared, cutting him off. The playfulness vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp authority. The Dreamweavers were hunted to extinction 300 years ago for a reason. They don't just shift, Malakor.
They walk in minds.
They twist reality. They are not wolves. They are parasites. She triggered a raid just by existing, Vex continued, pacing like a lawyer in a courtroom. If the rogues know what she is, others will come. She is a beacon for every dark thing in the forest. She cannot be allowed to walk free. Vex stopped, looking directly at the Alpha King. She is a threat to the stability of the 6 territories, Malakor. By the ancient laws of the Council, she must be contained. The silence that followed was heavier than the one that had preceded the fight.
All eyes turned to Malakor. He was the king. He was the law.
And Zephyra realized with a sinking heart that he had just saved her life only to be handed the warrant for her imprisonment.
Malakor turned to her.
The warmth she had seen in his eyes during the rescue was gone, replaced by the iron mask of the king. "Is it true?" he asked softly, so only she could hear.
I
don't know," Zephyra stammered, tears spilling over. "I don't know what I am." Malakor looked at her for a long moment, and then he closed his eyes, a look of profound resignation crossing his face. When he opened them, they were hard. "Alpha Vex is right," Malakor said, his voice ringing out like a judgment. "She cannot remain here." Zephyra felt her heart shatter for the second time that night. "Take her," Malakor commanded, but he stepped in front of Vex's guards as they moved forward.
"To my carriage. She is under the king's custody now.
And if anyone else wants to question my judgment." He let his eyes flare gold, the beast surfacing just beneath the skin. They can join the rogues on the floor. The silence that Malakor had commanded with his threat was brittle, a sheet of glass waiting to shatter. It held for a heartbeat, 2, perhaps 3, before the whispers began. They started low, like the rustling of dry leaves, then swelled into a murmur of dissent that rippled through the great hall. A dream weaver, a woman from the western pack hissed, clutching her own throat as if imagining invisible hands choking her. We were told they were all dead. If she is one of them, she is a parasite. A man's voice rose from the back, thick with fear.
She will twist our minds.
She will turn our alphas into puppets. Kill her before she wakes. The cry was sudden and sharp, acting as a catalyst. The fear in the room curdled instantly into aggression. The alphas who had been cowering moments ago now looked at Zephyra not as a defect, but as a predator. They bared their teeth, the sound of low, rumbling growls vibrating through the stone floor. It was a mob mentality, fueled by 3 centuries of nursery rhymes that painted dreamweavers as monsters who stole souls in the night. Alpha Vex watched the tide turn with a satisfied smirk. He didn't need to lift a finger. He had simply lit the match. You see, Malakor, Vex called out, his voice cutting through the rising din, you cannot simply take her into custody.
This is not a matter of petty crime.
This is a matter of species survival. The law dictates that any resurfaced dreamweaver must be purged. Purged, someone shouted in agreement. Burn the witch, another screamed. Zephyra stood in the center of the storm, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The blue silk dress felt like it was shrinking, crushing her ribs. She looked at her father, but he was staring at the floor, refusing to meet her eyes. Her mother was weeping silently, but she made no move to step forward.
They were letting it happen. They were letting the pack devour her.
Malakor stood like a breakwater against the crushing tide. He hadn't moved from his spot between Zephyra and the mob, his broad back a wall of black leather.
But Zephyra could see the tension in him now.
His shoulders were bracketed with muscle, his hands clenched into fists so tight the knuckles were white. Silence, Malakor commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the sheer power behind the word, the alpha authority, slammed into the room like a physical weight. The growling subsided, but the hostility remained, heavy and suffocating. You speak of laws, Malakor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly timbre as he turned to face the council. His golden eyes swept over them, daring anyone to challenge him.
You speak of purging.
You speak of fear. He took a step toward Vex, and the scarred alpha flinched despite himself. But you forget, Malakor continued, that there is a law older than the council. A law older than the Dreamweaver hunts. A law written in the blood of the first wolves. Vex narrowed his eyes. What are you babbling about? Hand her over, Malakor. Or are you so bewitched by her scent that you would risk a civil war? I am not bewitched, Malakor said coldly. He turned back to Zephyra. For a moment, the world narrowed down to just the two of them. The shouting crowd, the smell of blood, the burning torches, it all faded into the background. Malakor looked at her with an intensity that made her knees weak.
It wasn't pity. It wasn't anger. It was possession.
Absolute, unyielding possession. He reached out, his hand large and warm, and cupped her cheek. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her that was so strong she audibly gasped. It wasn't just heat. It was a feeling of rightness, of a key finally finding its lock. She is not a prisoner, Malakor announced, his voice ringing out with the finality of a gavel strike. And she is not a target. He looked up, meeting Vex's gaze with a feral grin. She is my mate. The words hung in the air, impossible and deafening.
The great hall went dead silent. The shock was absolute.
To claim a mate was rare. To claim a defective, non-shifting girl suspected of being a monster was unheard of.
It was political suicide. It was madness.
Zephyra stopped breathing.
Mate.
The word echoed in her skull, bouncing off the walls of her mind. She stared up at him, searching for the lie, searching for the strategy.
He had to be lying. He had to be saying it just to stop Vex from killing her. She was empty. She was the girl who couldn't shift.
A king did not mate with a cripple. But as she looked into those golden eyes, she felt the bond slam into her again. That terrifying primal resonance. Her dormant wolf, trapped behind the wall in her mind, scratched frantically at the barrier, whining, desperate to get to him.
It was too much.
The weight of it crushed her. The eyes of the entire hall were boring into her skin, judging, hating, envying.
She felt like a fraud standing on a pedestal she hadn't earned. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't a dream weaver.
She was just Zephyra, the disappointment, the broken thing. And now, the most powerful monster in the world had claimed her.
Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. The room started to spin.
The torches blurred into streaks of fire.
She couldn't be this. She couldn't be what he wanted.
When he realized she was truly broken, when the adrenaline faded and he saw she was just a hollow girl in a stolen dress, he would hate her.
"No,"
she whispered, pulling away from his touch. Malakor's brow furrowed, his hand hovering in the air. "Zephyra?"
"I can't," she choked out. "I can't do this."
Before he could react, before the guards could close in, Zephyra turned and ran.
She didn't run toward the carriage. She didn't run toward her family.
She ran toward the jagged hole the rogues had smashed in the side doors.
"Zephyra, stop!" Malakor roared, the sound shaking the floorboards. She didn't stop.
She hiked up the heavy skirts of the blue silk dress and sprinted into the night. The cold air hit her face like a slap, clearing the scent of blood and perfume from her nose, replacing it with the smell of pine and damp earth. She scrambled over the debris of the broken door, tearing the expensive silk on a splinter of wood, and hit the cobblestones running. Behind her, she heard the eruption of chaos, shouts, the sound of armor clanking, and the terrifying, earth-shaking roar of a massive wolf.
He was coming. Terror lent her speed she didn't know she possessed.
She tore off her heels, running barefoot across the cold ground, ignoring the sharp stones cutting into her soles. She bypassed the waiting carriages, bypassed the main road, and threw herself into the tree line. The forbidden forest loomed ahead, a wall of ancient shadows.
To everyone else, it was a place of death.
To Zephyra, it was the only place that had ever felt like home. She plunged into the undergrowth, the branches whipping at her face and arms, tearing at the dress until it was little more than rags. She ran until her lungs burned, until the lights of the council hall were swallowed by the trees, until the only sound was the pounding of her own heart and the distant, furious howling of the king who had just lost his prize.
The forest did not judge her.
It did not stare with hungry eyes or whisper cruelties about her empty bloodline. It only offered the cold embrace of the wind and the stinging slap of low-hanging branches. Zephyra ran until her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. The remnants of the blue silk dress, now mud-stained and tattered, dragged behind her like a shedding skin. She didn't stop until she reached the clearing, her sanctuary. It was a small circle of grass dominated by an ancient weeping willow, its branches trailing the ground like the hair of a mourning giant. She collapsed at the base of the trunk, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She curled into a ball, pressing her face into the damp earth, waiting for the inevitable.
She knew he would come. You could not run from a wolf, especially not one who wore a crown.
The sound of his arrival was not a crash of timber, but a sudden, suffocating silence.
The crickets stopped chirping. The wind died. Zephyra lifted her head.
Standing at the edge of the clearing was the wolf. He was a creature of night terrors, massive and midnight black, his fur absorbing the moonlight. He was panting slightly, his breath forming clouds of steam in the cold air, and his golden eyes, those terrible, beautiful eyes, were fixed on her with an intensity that pinned her to the tree.
He didn't growl. He didn't lunge.
He simply watched her, his posture rigid with restraint. "Go away," Zephyra whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, just leave me alone." The wolf lowered his head, a low rumble vibrating in his chest that wasn't aggression, but acknowledgement.
Then, the shadows around him seemed to warp. The crack and realignment of bone was a wet, sickening sound, but it was over in seconds. Malakor stood before her. He was shirtless, his combat leathers torn from the shift, his chest heaving. The moonlight traced the hard lines of his muscles and the old, silver scars that mapped his history of violence. He looked wild, dangerous, and utterly terrifying. "I cannot leave you," he said, his voice rough with the remnants of the growl. "You know I cannot. Because I am a prize." Zephyra spat, scrambling to her feet. She backed away until her spine hit the rough bark of the willow. "Because I am a dream weaver? Is that why you claimed me? To lock me up in a better cage than Vex would have?" Malakor took a step forward, his hands held out in a placating gesture that looked foreign on a man built for war. "I claimed you because you are mine, Zephyra. Because the bond demanded it." "The bond?" She let out a hysterical laugh. "What bond? I am empty, Malakor. Everyone knows it. I have no wolf. I have no magic. I am a fraud in a dress that cost more than my father makes in a year. If you feel a bond, it's a trick. It's a mistake." "It is not a mistake." He closed the distance between them, ignoring the way she flinched. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the scent of rain, pine, and the unique, electric musk of him. "And I did not claim you because of what Vex said." "Then why?" Zephyra demanded, tears finally spilling over, hot and angry. "Why tonight? Why did you look at me in the hall and turn away? If we are mates, why did you reject me first?" Malakor's expression shattered. The mask of the king fell away, revealing a man tormented by his own choices. He looked down at his hands, then back at her, his golden eyes filled with a raw vulnerability that stole the breath from her lungs. "Because I have known for weeks," he confessed quietly. Zephyra froze. "What?" 90 nights, Malakor said, the words heavy. "For 90 nights, I have come to this forest. I have walked these woods in my wolf form, looking for peace, looking for silence from the politics and the blood." He took a step closer, entering her personal space. "And for 19 nights, I found you here." Zephyra's eyes went wide. The monster in the dark. The presence she had felt watching her while she slept under the willow. It hadn't been a rogue. It hadn't been a threat. It had been him. "You." She breathed. "You were watching me." "I was guarding you," he corrected gently. "I found a girl sleeping in the dirt, unguarded, unloved by her pack. At first, I was angry. I wondered what kind of father would let his daughter wander the forbidden forest alone. But then, I stayed." He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from her face, trembling slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Why did you let me believe I was alone?" "Because you were broken, Zephyra," Malakor said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw the way you carried yourself. I saw the sadness you wear like a cloak. If I had walked out of the shadows and told you that the king was your mate, it wouldn't have been a gift. It would have been a chain. The weight of the crown, the weight of the expectations. I wanted to give you time. I wanted to wait until you were strong enough to bear it." "I'm not strong," she sobbed, sliding down the trunk of the tree again. "I'm nothing. I can't shift. I can't hear my wolf. I'm just empty space." Malakor knelt before her, heedless of the mud ruining his leather breeches. He was the king of shadows, the most feared alpha in the lands, and he was on his knees in the dirt for her. "You are not empty," he said fiercely. "You are the furthest thing from empty. Do you think I fell in love with a void?" The word hung in the air. "Love, not mate, love." "I watched you," Malakor continued, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "I watched you when you thought you were alone. I saw you talk to the trees as if they were old friends. I saw you reach out to the fireflies and guide them into patterns. I saw you hum a melody and watch the moonbeams bend to touch your palm." Zephyra stared at him, bewildered. "I was just playing. It was just imagination." "It was magic," Malakor corrected. Raw, ancient magic. You were weaving the world around you, Zephyra. You didn't know you were doing it, but I saw it. The forest didn't eat you because you charmed it. You are a dream weaver. Vex was right about the blood, but he was wrong about the soul. You aren't a monster. He finally closed the distance. He reached out and cupped her face in his large, warm hands. His thumbs brushed away the tears on her cheeks. You are the magic that this world forgot, he whispered. And I was yours long before the bond snapped into place in that hall. Zephyra stopped shaking. The terror of the chase, the shame of the council, the fear of the future, it all quieted under the weight of his touch. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. Truly, completely seen. Malakor, she breathed, testing the name on her tongue. Open to me, he commanded softly, his forehead resting against hers. Stop fighting it. Let the barrier down. She didn't know how, but his touch seemed to be the key. The warmth of his hands seeped into her skin, bypassing her fear, bypassing the wall she had built to protect herself from disappointment. It traveled down her spine and hit the hollow place in her chest. But it wasn't hollow anymore. A hum started deep inside her. It was low at first, like the vibration of a cello string, but it grew louder, warmer, filling the empty spaces. It was a song of recognition. Her dormant wolf, the creature that had been silent for 4 years, lifted its head from the darkness and let out a soft, answering whimper. Mate. The connection slammed into place, no longer a one-sided pull, but a two-way street of blinding, golden light. Zephyra gasped, clutching Malakor's wrists. She could feel him. She could feel his worry, his fierce protectiveness, and the overwhelming, terrifying depth of his adoration for her. I can feel you, she whispered, wonder coloring her tone. Malakor pulled back slightly, his golden eyes blazing with triumph and relief. And I can feel you, little weaver. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. Now, let's go home. I have a council to terrify, and you have a kingdom to learn. The peace of the clearing, so recently won, was shattered not by a noise, but by a sudden, oppressive heaviness in the air. The fireflies that Malakor had admired moments ago simply dropped dead, their lights extinguishing in unison as if a candle had been snuffed. Malakor stiffened against Zephyra, his body transforming from a warm embrace into a wall of granite. He shoved her behind him, his growl vibrating through her chest before she even saw the threat. Stay behind me, he commanded, his voice devoid of the tenderness it had held seconds before. Do not move. From the shadows of the tree line, they emerged. Not 10, not 20, but a legion. 40 rogue wolves, their eyes glowing with chemically induced madness, stepped into the moonlight, forming a suffocating ring of teeth and claws around the ancient willow. At the head of the pack stood a woman. She was striking and terrified all at once, her hair a cascade of liquid silver that mirrored the moon, her skin pale as bone. She wore robes of tattered gray silk that whispered against the grass. She didn't smell like a wolf. She smelled like ozone and old parchment, like a witch. A touching reunion. The woman purred, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over stone. The King of Shadows and his little broken toy. Ilara, Malakor snarled, recognizing her. You are a long way from the wastes. Did you come to die? I came to open the door, the witch replied, her gaze sliding past Malakor to lock onto Zephyra. It was a hungry, fanatical look. The seal has held for 3 centuries, Malakor. Chaos has been starving. And tonight, I have finally found the key. She pointed a long, pale finger at Zephyra. Her blood. The blood of a dream weaver, spilled on the roots of an elder tree. That is all it takes to break the seal and let the old gods back in. Zephyra felt the blood drain from her face. Key? Sacrifice? The nightmare kept shifting shapes, but the ending was always the same. Her death. Over my dead body, Malakor promised, his voice dropping to a terrifying, tectonic rumble. That, Ilara smiled, can be arranged. Kill him. The command was like a whip crack. The circle collapsed.
40 wolves lunged at once. Malakor shifted mid-air, the explosion of black fur and muscle acting as a shockwave that knocked the first wave of attackers backward. He was a titan among them, a creature of pure, refined violence. He caught the first wolf in his jaws and snapped its neck with a flick of his head, using the body as a flail to bludgeon 2 others aside.
It was a display of power that defied logic.
He moved faster than thought, a blur of shadow that tore through the rogues like a scythe through wheat. Limbs were severed, throats were torn, and the grass turned slick with black blood.
But there were too many.
For every wolf he killed, 3 more took its place. They swarmed him like ants on a beetle, biting at his hamstrings, latching onto his flanks, tearing at his ears. Zephyra watched, screaming his name, her hands pressed to her mouth as the black fur became matted with red. He was fighting an impossible battle, and he was doing it for her.
He wasn't retreating. He wasn't maneuvering for an escape.
He was holding the line, keeping the tide of monsters 5 feet away from where she stood frozen against the tree. "Malakor!" she shrieked as a massive grey wolf clamped its jaws onto his shoulder, shaking its head violently. Malakor roared, a sound of agony and rage, and ripped the attacker off, throwing him into the trunk of an oak tree with bone-shattering force. But the moment of distraction cost him. 2 more wolves slammed into his hind legs, bringing him down to his knees. Then they were on him. A wave of fur and teeth buried the king. "No!" Zephyra screamed, the sound tearing her throat raw. She scrambled forward, her fear forgotten in the face of his pain. But Alara was there. The witch caught Zephyra by the hair, yanking her back with surprising strength. "Watch!" she hissed, forcing Zephyra's head up. "Watch the last obstacle fall." In the center of the pile, Malakor fought with the desperation of a dying god. He threw them off, rising one last time, his golden eyes finding Zephyra's through the chaos. He was bleeding from a dozen deep wounds, his breath coming in wet, rattling gasps. "Run!" his voice echoed in her mind, weak and fading. "Run, little weaver." A rogue struck him from behind, driving him face first into the dirt.
He didn't get up.
The sight of him falling, the invincible king, the man who had looked at her broken pieces and called them magic, shattered something inside Zephyra.
It wasn't a crack. It was a demolition.
The psychological dam she had built 4 years ago, the wall of shame and fear that held her spirit captive, didn't just break. It evaporated. The silence in her mind was replaced by a roar that sounded like the ocean, like a hurricane, like the end of the world.
"Let me out." It wasn't a request.
It was a demand from the very core of her soul. Zephyra opened her mouth to scream, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a harmonic resonance, a frequency so high and powerful that Alara released her hair and stumbled back, clutching her ears as blood trickled from them. The air in the clearing distorted. Heat, blistering and white-hot, exploded outward from Zephyra's body. The mud beneath her feet turned to glass instantly. The grass within a 10-foot radius incinerated into ash. "What is this?" Alara shrieked, shielding her eyes from the blinding light. Zephyra didn't answer.
She was burning. She was dying. She was being born.
Her bones snapped and reformed, not with the agonizing crunch of a normal shift, but with the fluid grace of mercury reshaping itself.
She grew. And grew. And grew.
When the light faded, the girl in the tattered blue dress was gone. Standing in her place was a nightmare made of starlight. She was massive, easily a head taller than Malakor, dwarfing the rogue wolves like a lioness standing among jackals. Her fur was not the grey or brown of common wolves. It was a blinding, iridescent silver white that seemed to glow from within. Her eyes were not gold or blue. They were swirling nebulas of violet and white, devoid of pupils, seeing everything and nothing. The rogues stopped their attack on Malakor's prone body. They froze, whimpering, their tails tucking between their legs as the sheer predatory aura of the Dreamweaver washed over them. It wasn't just fear of a larger predator, it was the primal terror of facing a higher being. Alara stared up at the silver wolf, her face a mask of absolute horror. "Impossible," she whispered. The legends, they were just stories. The silver wolf looked at the witch.
She didn't growl.
She simply exhaled, and the air in front of her rippled like a heat mirage.
Then, she moved.
She didn't run, she displaced space. One moment she was by the tree, the next she was in the center of the pack. She snapped her jaws, and the sound was like a thunderclap. She didn't just bite the nearest rogue, she obliterated him. The force of her jaw's strength sent a shockwave through his body that shattered every bone before her teeth even pierced the skin. The pack broke. Panic, blind and absolute, took over.
But there was no escape. Zephyra was a storm.
She swiped a massive paw, and the ground erupted, sending 3 wolves flying into the air as if gravity had reversed. She slammed her paws down, and the earth shook, knocking the rest off their feet. She was precision and chaos intertwined, a dancer of death moving through the clearing with terrifying elegance. She tore through them, not out of cruelty, but out of a cold, protective necessity. They had touched him. Within seconds, the 40 wolves were reduced to a scattering of fleeing survivors and broken bodies. Alara, seeing her plan crumble, turned to flee, muttering an incantation to open a portal. Zephyra turned her violet gaze on the witch. She backed, a sharp, resonating sound that hit the witch like a physical hammer. Alara's spell shattered in her hands, the magic dissolving into harmless sparks. The witch fell to her knees, sobbing, as the massive silver wolf loomed over her.
But Zephyra didn't kill her. She had something more important to do.
She turned away from the cowering witch and padded toward the pile of bodies where Malakor lay. The silver light of her fur cast a halo over him. He was barely breathing, his black fur matted with blood, his eyes closed.
Zephyra lowered her massive head.
She whined, a sound that was heartbreakingly human in its grief, and nudged his neck with her wet nose.
Malakor.
The bond, which had been a thin thread before, suddenly roared to life. It wasn't just a connection now, it was a flood. Molten gold poured from her mind into his, a torrent of life force and magic. She pushed her power into him, willing his heart to beat, willing his wounds to knit. Under her touch, the King of Shadows stirred. His golden eyes fluttered open, hazy with pain, but when they focused on the radiant, silver giant hovering over him, clarity returned in a rush.
He didn't look afraid. He looked awestruck.
Beautiful, he rasped in the mind link, his voice weak but filled with a reverence that shook her to her core. Zephyra licked the blood from his muzzle, her violet eyes swirling with tears she couldn't shed. She lay down beside him, curling her massive, silver body around his broken form, creating a fortress of light and fur that no monster, witch, or army would ever dare to breach again. The silver light that had flooded the clearing didn't vanish, it simply settled, absorbing back into Zephyra's skin like water into dry earth. The transformation was no longer a cage or a trial. It was as natural as breathing. One moment she was the towering, celestial wolf, and the next, she was a girl standing barefoot in the scorched grass, the cool night air biting at her skin.
But she wasn't cold.
The fire inside her, the Dreamweaver's fire, was finally awake.
Malakor was already there.
He had shifted back the moment her healing magic had knit his worst wounds, though his torso was still mapped with angry red welts and the ghost of bruises.
He didn't care.
He stripped off the remnants of his leather vest, now little more than shredded strips, and wrapped his heavy cloak around her shoulders.
He didn't speak.
He just pulled the fabric tight at her throat, his knuckles brushing her jaw, his golden eyes scanning her face as if trying to memorize a new map. "The witch?" Zephyra asked, her voice raspy but steady. "Gone," Malakor murmured, glancing at the empty space where Alara had cowered. "She ran while you were healing me. Let her run. She carries the story of what happened here. Let her tell Vex that the monster he feared is real." Zephyra looked toward the edge of the forest, back the way she had come. Somewhere miles away, the council hall was likely in uproar. Her father was probably wringing his hands, wondering if his daughter was dead or if he'd be blamed for her existence. Her mother was likely weeping silent, useless tears. "I can't go back," Zephyra whispered.
"Not to them. Not to that house."
You have no house there, Malakor said, his voice low and possessive. He placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her toward the path that led not to the town, but to the mountain pass where his territory began. Your home is the Obsidian Peaks.
Your home is with me.
Zephyra didn't look back. She left the tattered remains of the blue silk dress in the mud, a shedding of her old skin, and walked into the darkness with the King of Shadows. The journey to the Obsidian Peaks was a blur of exhaustion and relief. When they finally arrived at the citadel, a fortress of black stone carved directly into the mountain's jagged spine, the sun was threatening to breach the horizon. The guards at the gate didn't ask questions. They smelled the blood, they smelled the power radiating from the girl wrapped in their king's cloak, and they bowed low. Malakor led her straight to the royal chambers. It was a space that mirrored him, vast, dark, and imposing, with a massive fireplace that roared to life the moment they entered. He sat her down on the edge of the massive bed, its sheets made of black silk.
He fetched a basin of warm water and a cloth.
When she reached for it, he stopped her hand. "Let me," he said. Zephyra sat still as the Alpha King, the most dangerous killer in the 6 territories, gently wiped the mud and dried blood from her feet. His touch was reverent, a silent worship. He moved up to her hands, cleaning the dirt from under her fingernails, then to her face. "I thought I was broken," Zephyra confessed into the quiet of the room. The fire popped, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. "For 4 years, I thought the gods had made a mistake." Malakor paused, his hand cupping her cheek. "The gods don't make mistakes like you, Zephyra. They make weapons. They make miracles." He sat beside her, the mattress shifting under his weight. The adrenaline of the fight had faded, leaving behind a raw, aching vulnerability. The bond between them, now fully open, hummed with a low, golden note. It was a physical tether. She could feel his heartbeat sinking with hers. "I was so afraid," she whispered, looking into his golden eyes.
"Not of the wolves. Of you."
"I was afraid you would see me and leave." "I could no more leave you than I could leave my own skin," Malakor swore. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I have walked in shadows for a decade, Zephyra.
I have ruled with fear and blood.
But tonight, when you turned into that light,
I saw the dawn." He kissed her then.
It wasn't the hungry, desperate kiss of the council hall. It was slow, deep, and filled with a promise of eternity. It was a seal on the bond, a confirmation that this wasn't just biology or magic, it was a choice. "You will never be alone again," he murmured against her lips.
"No more hiding in the forest. No more silence.
We are a pack of 2, and we will burn anyone who tries to separate us." Zephyra closed her eyes, letting the truth of his words settle into her bones.
She wasn't the empty girl. She was the vessel of ancient magic. She was the mate of the king.
Hours later, as the sun finally crested the mountains, Zephyra stood on the high balcony of the citadel. She wore a gown of deep velvet that Malakor had found for her, a sharp contrast to the blue silk of her past. Below, the territory of the Obsidian Peaks stretched out, a land of hard stone and fierce warriors. Beyond that lay the forest, and beyond that, the other territories where Vex was undoubtedly rallying his forces. Ilara would be whispering poison in the ears of every alpha who would listen. The hunt for the Dreamweaver wouldn't stop, it would become a war. Malakor stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, looking out at the same horizon. "They will come for us," he said, stating the fact without fear. "I know," Zephyra replied. She reached down and placed her hand over his. A spark of silver magic danced across her knuckles, twisting and shaping itself into a small, corporeal wolf made of light before dissolving into the wind. "Let them come," Zephyra said, her voice strong, ringing with the authority of a queen who had finally found her crown. "I am done hiding. If Vex wants a war, I will weave him a nightmare he will never wake up from." Malakor smiled against her neck, a feral, satisfied sound. "Long live the queen." The sun rose, bathing the Obsidian Peaks in gold, signaling the end of the night and the beginning of their reign. Thank you for reading Zephyra and Malakor's story. If you enjoyed this journey from the Forbidden Forest to the Obsidian Throne, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next adventure. What do you think will happen in the war against Alpha Vex? Will the other territories side with the Dreamweaver, or will they fear her power?
Let me know your theories in the comments below. Your support helps us create more stories like this. See you in the next one.